Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar brought to you today by Style Homes. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. And our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And one of the ways that we continue to do that is through this online channel, the Voice of Authority. It's a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions and challenges and influences and issues of urgency. And on that note, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities tells us that community-led housing is a great way to ensure local housing needs are met by putting local people in the driving seat. The Community Land Trust Network tells us that 1 council in 6 has policies to support community-led housing, while 1 in 3 has given grants or loans for community-led housing. And at least 208 public sites have been sold or leased to community-led housing groups. And DLUHC also tells us that community-led housing also helps improve the design and construction quality of homes using modern methods of construction, and gives more opportunity for smaller house builders to work on projects growing local economies. But how accessible are modern methods of construction, or MMC, to community groups? Do the benefits of MMC really only accrue at a larger scale than community-led schemes operate at? And do offsite manufacturers really offer sustainable solutions for community groups? Tend to be high on their order of wishes. So to tackle these questions, we've assembled a cracking panel, and it's a pleasure to introduce to the Voice of Authority today, in alphabetical order, Mark Bagent, who is Corporate Director of Regeneration and Culture at the London Borough of Redbridge, and Reino Benning, who is the founder of Style Homes, and Levant Kerimol, who is Director of Community-Led Housing London, and Cheryl Scott, who's a Development Manager, Development Consultant at Brent Community Land Trust. Make the most of this expertise assembled on your screens, viewers, by firing in your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll address as many of those as we can during the course of the conversation. We welcome your observations in the chat also, and we've got a few questions for you via the online survey function, and you can contribute to the discussion by answering those as they pop up onto your screens over the next hour. And let's get the first of those underway for you. I'm going to launch your first poll now and look forward to receiving your responses to that. While you're responding, we can get the discussion started. Let's turn to Cheryl. Cheryl, what's the capacity for community land trusts to meet housing needs?
I think that's a lead question.
Well, I sort of want to know from the capacity of an individual trust. You know,
right.
When you're working in Brent, how much housing need can you respond to?
Well, because most of the groups that I'm working with at the moment, so I'm working with Brent Community Land Trust, Crystal Palace, and also London CLT. And what we're finding is local authorities tend to dispose of sites that are quite complex and difficult, or they've been sort of hanging around for some time. They're not quite clear what to do with it. And then, you know, they propose potentially a community land trust to take that site on. So they tend to be schemes that are as low as maybe 7 homes. Brent, we're looking between 20 and 25 homes. So they're quite small schemes, and they tend to be, you know, garage sites or parking spaces that are underused, and just disused pieces of land that get up against the railway line, those sorts of things. So they're always quite complex, licenses, way leaves over them, those sorts of things, and those are the type of sites at the moment that are coming forward. So the capacity is quite small. However, it may not address housing need in terms of local authorities. Certainly in London have huge demand for housing need, and they need thousands of homes, and this is a small quantum, but it meets a specific need within a community. So what the community groups are doing is actually providing affordable homes in perpetuity, unlike perhaps what local authorities and housing associations are doing. Their homes may start off affordable, but they can end up in the private sector through right to buy or right to acquire. These homes can't do that. They have to remain affordable for the community.
Crucial points. Thanks, Cheryl. And is it fair to say, to typify a community-led group as being a single site developer?
I think that's the starting point. So it's normally a group of volunteers, they come together or they live in an area where there's a particular site that becomes an environmental problem. It's neglected, people dump on these sites, all sorts of issues take place. The group then comes together and then they say, look, what can we do? What can we deliver for the community? Sometimes it's not actually housing, it may be a community hub, or it could be a combination of both housing and a community hub. So they're literally trying to clean up their area and get something useful out of a neglected site.
Thanks, Cheryl. And Lev, how does that scale up over London as a whole? What kind of capacity have these groups got to respond to housing need across the city and indeed further afield?
I mean, it's interesting. We've never actually counted the number of volunteers and members involved. That would be an impressive number, I think, which always astonishes me because, as Cheryl was saying, they're all volunteers by and large. I think in the sort of 4.5 years we've been going as a support agency for groups and also for councils, we've engaged with almost 100 groups or so. We have been managing the early stage of the GLA's Community Housing Fund, and I think around 60 projects have received sometimes a tiny bit of funding just to explore an idea or do a little bit of training. And then I think there's about 30 projects that are kind of live and progressing to deliver between sort of 400 to 500 starts on site, which is kind of the GLA's target out of that funding. They vary. I think it's worth mentioning not all of them are doing direct development. Some of those are kind of working with partners who might do the development phase. So be that, I mean, so Mark will be familiar, Redbridge has a project with London CLT, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, but some have been working with kind of much larger housing associations. There are a couple of examples where the St Anne's hospital site, where the GLA's development partner is being asked to offer up to kind of at least 50 homes for a community-led group. London Legacy Development Corporation has something similar with their development partner. So kind of little phases or blocks out of very large schemes are also possible. But I mean, if we look at the development side, I think in terms of skills and capacity, it also varies on the type of group. So some groups, as Cheryl said, are kind of like based on a local geography. So they want to make their local area better and address a housing need locally. And they might be people who aren't necessarily directly benefiting from the housing themselves. They just want to see something good happen for the local community. And they tend to maybe have some built environment experience or expertise, not necessarily. And then there are other groups who are looking to provide housing primarily for themselves as a community, i.e. they want to live together or they've got a particular need, so they might be slightly more demographic in flavour as well. So we've got groups of single parents with absolutely no built environment experience, and then others who are much more like self-builders who maybe have a couple of architects in the group and mix of others. So that in terms of the capacity of groups, there's varying degrees of professionalization and what they're looking for out of schemes. And I think one of our roles is to supplement that with professional expertise where we can. So we've got a number of associate advisors, and they can bring the kind of experience and mentoring in terms of making decisions about how they go about doing development, what routes to take, what options they have, etc.
Thanks, Lev. And I just want to unpack that very slightly, because Cheryl was talking very much about specific site-orientated development, so communities sort of coming together around a site. But you mentioned something about a single parents group wanting to build. So these can be different kinds of interest. That's a sort of social interest, isn't it? People who just feel an affinity for each other and want to share facilities.
Yeah, some of them have kind of values in common. Some of them have just got together by accident. Sometimes it's not the purpose. They just happen to be single parents, and they've all met through experiences in with that particular group experiences in temporary accommodation, which they get lumped in with people with drug and alcohol problems, and they've got young kids and they're knocking down doors at 3 a.m. and they were like, well, actually what we'd like to do is have something separate, which is exclusively with single parents, maybe have some sort of shared creche space that we can collectively manage. And you can see that there's a logic for, you know, and they arguably would be maybe a priority group. A good example is the older women's co-housing project, where again they've decided there's an age thing and a thing that brings them together. That's probably over a wider geography. It may even be London wide, but it's, you know, so community. It's that thing of communities can be all sorts of different things. Sometimes it's a group of friends that just want to live together. I think they tend to be either what you might call co-housing or cooperative type groups, and then the community land trusts tend to be people who might volunteer in their local area. We've also got a couple of projects where it's an existing community organisation, such as a kind of an independent church or a community centre, which might have a spare bit of land or capacity to build above their single-storey community building, and they want to do something to address the housing needs in the wider community. So that's another form of, I guess, community-led houses. They take very different forms.
So there's a real diverse set of drivers behind these groups. Mark, it seems to me like something that could catch on. You know, as more people understand that this is the art of the possible, that they'll coalesce around those shared interests and those shared values. So there's a lot of potential for growth. But at the moment, sort of 400, 500 starts across London. That's not really touching Redbridge's need. Never mind the whole city. So how do you see the sort of opportunity of harnessing these organisations from the point of view of a council?
Yeah, I mean, really, there are two different types of scheme here. I think there's the ones where land is made available to a group and they take all their own development risk, and they take on the land, they take on designing and funding and building, perhaps with some support from their local authority or LEVS group or the GLA, but in effect they're the developer. And then you've got the situations, which is really what's happening in Redbridge at the moment, where the council is taking the development risk, the council is leading on the development. So we're effectively building a product for the Community Land Trust to take on. They're buying it from us, if you like, once we've built it, just like a housing association would. But as Cheryl said, the ownership of that product going forward, the allocation of that to the people who move into it, and the future protection of that in perpetuity as affordable housing is a different construct. So it's important that people understand that it is legally different, and there's pros and cons in that. So that it's a product for a particular group of people and it has a particular purpose. It's something we're definitely supporting. But so we might build a block of 50 flats, and there might be 5 or 10 of those that are for the Community Land Trust, and then there'll be others that are being sold as shared ownership or affordable rent or market sale or market rent. So it could be a whole mix within one block. And just to add to the complication, we're also constructing community hubs, which are a mix of council services, community services, health services, and those will be within the same buildings that these homes will be within. They're being co-designed, co-produced with the community, but that's a slightly different process to the process of designing the homes, which are then going into the Community Land Trust. So I hope that's not too confusing, but basically all of that comes from the same ethos, which is about involving people in the buildings that they're going to use or live in. And that involvement can go all the way to actually owning and managing those buildings once they've been developed.
And what about at the beginning of the process? You mentioned involvement in the design of the buildings themselves. If you're building 50 units and 5 of those are available to a trust, How involved is that trust in the design and the sort of development process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge, that we're going through a learning process around how early do you involve people, how fully are they involved in that design process. And I think, you know, from my point of view, the sky's the limit. We should be involving people as much as possible. I think one of the challenges is who do we involve, and how do we attract the right people and target the right people. So for something like our community hubs, obviously we're going out to local residents, local community organisations, voluntary organisations, and bringing in a wide range of people to create a vision for that hub, for that area. When it comes to the Community Land Trust, you may have an existing group. There are groups that Lev's referred to, or it might be more appropriate to create something new and to attract people in who are going to build something very specific, very bespoke to the local needs of that community. So I think we have to be open to all those opportunities, all those possibilities, and not have a kind of restricted view of it.
Great, thanks, Mark. And we've got just over a third of our viewers have delivered community-led housing on council land. So there's 2/3 of the viewers that don't have experience of this. And we've got a question in from a viewer already. Joe Garner's asking if there's a central point of contact or a list of land available for community-led development. Lev, do you want to pick up on that, and then maybe Mark and Cheryl?
I think that I suppose we'd probably be the closest thing in London, at least, as a central point of contact, but there isn't a single list of land, just because all the routes are really different. There's 33 councils. I think there's in London, maybe I'd say a third of councils have got either some program-based approach where they're releasing sites typically through the GLA's small sites, small builders portal, and then others have bespoke one-off disposals, or they are doing development and then disposing. So they take slightly different forms, and also they don't all happen at one moment in one go. So it's kind of watch this space and see when things are being disposed. But I think we have been encouraging a move towards more of a kind of program-based approach, where it's not, I think in the early days, it would have to be a group getting together and then kind of putting together a campaign and saying, we want this. And I think we've seen more of a move towards local authorities sort of saying, okay, this is a nice thing, and maybe it's a very small part of our program. And as Cheryl says, it might be a site that's maybe otherwise difficult or tricky for the council to deliver themselves, and why don't we let the community have a go at this one, for example. So there's definitely more of a sort of proactive approach that I think we've seen.
So basically just Google community-led housing London, and your contact details are there. Yeah. And Cheryl, any other contacts that you'd pass on to an aspiring community-led organisation?
No, I think as Lev said, a lot of the sites come via the small sites programme. That would be via the GLA website, and if you just kind of Google small sites, then you will find from time to time a number of sites that are going to be put out, but there is a competition, so you may be competing with other community groups for that parcel of land, and it is resource intensive. I mean, it takes quite some time to get local authority to go through their approvals, a whole range of due diligence, and then obviously the group formation committees, going through a development process of community engagement and consultation. So it does take some time, and there is always a risk that group members may fall away during the process if it takes too long. So one of the challenges is to try and speed the process up to get these sites completed fairly quickly. And
on that note, Mark, any other advice you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Cheryl was just saying. So, I mean, every local authority should be open to a conversation with a local group who want to come forward and talk to them. But it's true, not every local authority has organised themselves in a way that, actively puts it out there. And to be honest, a lot of them, you know, they don't have loads and loads of sites available all the time. So there's real difficulty in finding the sites. I think Cheryl said earlier on, they tend to be smaller sites, and that's not because local authorities are kind of keeping all the best kind of thing, but local authorities are probably going to be looking at economies of scale around their own development programme. And I know we'll come on to that in terms of MMC, but you know, if we can spend our resources on building a larger site out, that's probably a better use of our resources to start with than starting with the smaller ones. You know, and there'll be sometimes a smaller site where it's got a particular local community interest, and so having a community-led approach to it just fits perfectly if it's next to a community centre or you know, next to a park or something. There's some other local interest group that particularly wants to get involved. So I think if I think back to when I was at Tower Hamlets, so there was a very active forum in Tower Hamlets that the council ran, which brought together people interested in community building, self-building, and a lot of work was done there around a policy towards how land would be made available, what kind of valuation land would be sold, how it would be protected in terms of long-term covenants on use and so on. So people have done a lot of work on this, and it is definitely worth talking to your local authority if you're a community representative or resident.
Is it fair to say where local authorities have their own arm's length sort of development companies, wholly owned development companies, that quite often those are actually set up with a view towards developing small sites? So they might have a sort of perhaps a better idea of available small sites in a borough, Mark?
They might do. I mean, it's different in every borough. I think one of the most interesting questions is who identifies the next pipeline of delivery sites. And you could run a whole webinar on that, Toby, because it's quite an interesting thing as to how you spot the next opportunity and how you evaluate it. So some of those companies will have people out there looking for sites. Some authorities will do it differently, and they'll use their internal regen team or their internal housing management and maintenance team to identify new opportunities. And sometimes it's local ward councillors or local residents who have been concerned for years about a particular site where there's antisocial behaviour or other issues, and they will campaign for that to be turned into a housing development. I mean, that does actually happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm something interesting on that. Thanks for the tip, by the way. We'll run that. It sounds good, because I heard from a local authority recently that with the next wave of austerity coming in, the next wave of cuts, there are very few services left that aren't statutory, that haven't already been cut. So one of the things that might well get cut is a site allocation process, because it's not necessarily statutory. So it's one of the things that can go, and that would further hamper that whole process you've talked about. So I think we should dig into that a bit more. But Lev, I know you wanted to come in there.
I was just going to add to that. One of the really interesting ones we've come across is Camden have a call for small sites, which is asking the community or asking residents which sites are problems that you think might be developable, which is a really interesting way of doing it and kind of crowdsourcing those ideas. It'll be, I don't know if people are coming up with the same things that the council are already aware of, or other things that maybe they hadn't thought of or didn't think were perhaps developable. So yeah, watch that space.
So we'll get Camden onto that webinar. Yeah, thanks, Lev. Okay, Reno, let's turn to the sort of meat of the conversation, which is how MMC can support community trust and community-led groups aspirations. What's the capacity? We've heard about sites from 7 units up to perhaps 50 units that Mark mentioned, and on hospital sites and the Olympic site that Lev referred to. We're talking about sort of 400 to 500 units across the city, but in pretty small clusters, and organised by groups that don't necessarily have huge amounts of resources, either in terms of skills or capacity to deliver. So what's the capacity of Style Homes? Do you want to describe your product a bit and how it might be applicable to those groups?
Hello, everyone. It is very complex. When I'm listening to Mark, Lev and Cheryl, and it's really bespoke developments what they need. The production of that, when outside manufacturing, is already a longer time going. Our product is a little different because we don't work with wood, we work with metal, because we work with metal frame things. I think the whole complexity from what we just discussed and the demand is just depending on the region, the community where it's for, because that's the important part. And I think with offsite manufacturing, the capacity is there to deliver those things, affordable, and in these times with the energy consumption, low energy consumption, but it's just what is asked for. It will be a bespoke product when I hear them talking, because it's every time a different situation, a different group of people, older women, different specification than parents, single parents with children. There will be always a mixture. And I think with those products that we can deliver, especially they're movable, they're affordable, and very important, low energy consumption, people have low energy bills. But it has to be always in people's house. That's an important thing for whom is it designed. And I think small or big, it's all possible. It's just demanding what the demand is for that position location.
And what is it that you're supplying?
We're supplying is a mixture. It's a 1-bedroom version house that you can move. By the way, by coincidence, it's delivered. The first one is delivered this Saturday to Hastings as a demonstration one. But you can have versions of that. You can have a 1-bedroom, the 2-bedrooms. This is a 2-story house. You can have a 1-story, or you can even have a single-story house. It's all depending on the needs. This is quite bespoke. And then you go further. The next step is a complete family home with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 0 energy, because it uses no energy, because all to do that is available these days in the markets. In the past, it would be very costly to construct something like that. It is more costly than a normal house, but it is not that more costly than a normal house. And you save so much in energy bills. Because in principle, what we can do is we can deliver for all the separate location, the separate developments that were there, and a separate group of people or communities that need a certain type of house. Because it's really mixed developments you could make from them.
And you say low energy use in the house once built, but these are frames manufactured in Holland, yeah, in the Netherlands. So what's the carbon footprint in the production process like compared to other approaches?
It is all these days. It's all renewable materials that you use. So they have all a very low carbon footprint. The only negativity that we have, you got to transport it over, but transport will be by boat or train, and that are the most low carbon transportations that you can have. That doesn't weigh up to all the positive sides of it. The only thing what I said in the past, it is possible to produce them in the UK, but we as a starting company, we don't have the facilities there. And to set facilities off or a proven product of a proven production process, why would you interrupt that in these days? Because it's not only the demand, and again, I'll repeat myself, Mark, they say, it's also can you deliver? Because that's also a big problem in these days. Prices are very difficult, supply is very difficult. But when you have a supply chain that's working, even when it's done abroad, why wouldn't you use that?
No. Absolutely. And one of the things I discovered looking into MMC is the moment you're using steel, even if it's manufactured in the UK, it often travels outside the UK as part of the process before it ends up on site. So that transport factor is probably in all cases. René, I've got one last question, which is the elephant in the room, and it's a difficult one to answer because, as you said, every development is bespoke. But what's the cost per unit? What sort of cost are you looking at for one of these?
When you have there's a single bedroom, it's a 1-story house. There's it's 38 square meters, and it would be around £120,000 delivered on site, every site in the UK. The plus of that is that house is full electric, 60% self-efficient with solar panels, so you would have very low energy bills, and it's a very solid movable house. That's something also I want to highlight, what very often is done abroad, and it was mentioned previously, I think it was Cheryl. There are sites, and we do that abroad quite a bit, that are major developments, take quite a long time to get going. And the sites are lying vacant there. With those systems, you can place those houses on it, they're movable. You can move them and move them and move them again. They're made to move. And that's a cost-saving factor. And you use the sites, this for certain periods. We got a certain site in the Netherlands at the moment. There were 20 placed there, and the site will now be developed for 40. Those little ones will be moved, and there will be new ones there, bigger ones, and more. A mixed development will now be created. The ones that are moved are relocated in another position again.
Thanks. Thanks, Reno. That's really helpful, and goes some way to answering Audley English's question. But we'll come back to your question, Audley, because there's some other angles to that. First, I just want to ask Cheryl to kind of respond to that as a case study of MMC and the usefulness of that product, but also to understand a bit more about how MMC is being applied in Brent and your experience of it, Cheryl. How accessible it is for community-led groups that you've worked with.
Right, I mean, my experience of it is limited to the extent where we haven't actually procured a scheme. So what I've been doing is research on behalf of the group. The group are keen to use MMC because the view is for some of the reasons that you set out, Reno. It's about, you know, cost in use, efficiency, the fact that construction prices are completely through the roof at the moment in the UK. We've had issues with supply chains following on from Brexit, build cost inflation, all of these issues. So for us, the challenge is coming up with a design that has a level of repetition. It's an efficient design that will lend itself to a form of MMC. Now, we're also governed, because we receive public subsidy, we're governed partially by design regulations in terms of unit sizes. I think you mentioned your house has been 38 metres square. I mean, we would normally build a one-bedroom flat for 50 metres squared. Mm-hmm. However, we are looking at the scheme for single occupancy, so it could be between 20 and 30 metres squared, but traditionally we tend to follow the London plan, which is a criteria that's set out by the mayor. So based on the sort of research that we've been looking at to date, we've found it quite interesting. We've spoken to some of these MMC companies, and we've discounted some of them because they are not really the direct manufacturers. We've encountered where you may have a middle person, and that's something we're trying to avoid. We want to deal direct with a manufacturer, provide warranties and assurances and accreditations and all of those sorts of things. But it really comes down to, you know, the design of that scheme. What's going to fit onto the site, and will it lend itself to MMC? And then obviously there's an issue around tenure. So if it's for rent, we'll be, you know, whichever type of tenure, we're going to go to the private sector to borrow some money, and those funders need confidence that the product that's being produced is either mortgageability issues or that it's going to stand the test of time. We look at long-term maintenance. With regard, I think you also mentioned about energy use, which is quite crucial. We're now facing this cost of living crisis, energy bills going through the roof. So we want a product that offers sustainability, potential renewable energies that can be used where we can, you know, address things like fuel poverty. I'm not sure if I've answered the question, Toby, but
yeah, you absolutely you have.
Those are the key issues coming up again and again when we're researching.
And we'll give Reno a chance to respond to some of the points you've raised. But first, I just want to ask Lev what your experience, Lev, is of MMC across the schemes that you've got experience of in London, but also further afield.
Yeah, it's not come up in London as much, and I don't really know exactly why that is. It could be because there's a presumption that it's somehow a prefabricated product, and many of the sites that, you know, the smaller sites that groups are dealing with are quite small, complex, odd angles, you know, lots of different things going on in terms of overlooking, and you have to really craft the buildings. And I know that there'll be different kinds of MMC that lend themselves more to that rather than perhaps the volumetric solution. I think there's the real opportunities are probably in, I mean, another thing that feels difficult is at a early stage in the project, trying to hang your hat on just one supplier, because it almost feels like you need to, if you are going down a route, that kind of needs to be in your planning application, and you're almost having to decide your form of construction before you submit your planning, whereas the traditional sequence is kind of the other way around. You get your planning and then you work out how you might build it, and then by that point it might be too late to use something that's sort of predefined. So I don't know if it's those reasons, plus perhaps the perception that it is, you know, likely to be more cost effective at scale. So if you are doing smaller schemes, and I think, you know, we were talking earlier, the average scheme size sort of between 10 and 15 of those smaller sites, 10 or 15 units. So it hasn't cropped up that much. And I think Brent CLT is the only one where it has cropped up, because, you know, and it's kind of come from the fact that they are particularly focused on single people as a demographic that they wanted to serve. Somehow the site that they've identified lends itself towards that, and it's almost like a repeatable stacked thing. And then you sort of think, okay, this maybe makes sense to look at it on this site, and maybe they can take it up to like 20, maybe 25 of those units. So it's slightly on the larger side, even though it's not massive, but yeah.
And outside London, when we were talking in preparation for this session, the impression you gave was that outside London it's a little bit more, maybe not common, but you do find examples.
I think, yeah, there are all sorts of people in the pre-manufactured field that kind of see an affinity, and I think the opportunity is that you have something which has cost certainty. So the point at which you get that cost certainty might be an issue, but trying to progress with a project and then find out that when you tender, you've already maybe worked out your viability in your appraisal, and then most of the groups we're talking about don't have the wriggle room to pay that little bit extra, because they've agreed with their lenders what they can borrow, and they don't have the kind of asset base to flex that as much, perhaps. So I think for that reason, maybe it is a bit more attractive. And I guess if you've got a slightly larger site with fewer constraints than, or maybe outside of London, you're talking about lower density and you can just put a series of houses down, then maybe it does lend itself more to that, but it depends probably a lot on the system. So
yeah, thanks a lot, Liv. Now we're going to come back to that that certainty of cost thing. I'll play that back to Reino later as well, but first let's turn to Mark, because I want to, Mark, you have actually built MMC, so I'd like to hear your impressions of how applicable Reino and other models are, but also we got a question from Joe Garner that I'd like you to address as well, if you don't mind, which is how likely it is that councils can step outside of minimum space standards if other elements of a scheme are exemplar, i.e. sustainability, energy rating, carbon footprint, and so on.
Yeah, so I mean, what we've now touched into really in particular is about accommodation for rough sleepers and single homeless people, which I think was some of what Lev was referring to. So, I mean, in Redbridge, we've got what was built by Salvation Army, Project Malachi. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but if people Google Project Malachi, you'll see it's essentially a hostel that's been built out of modular units in the centre of Ilford. I'm also involved as a board member with Haringey Community Benefit Society, which has a smaller modular housing for single people, again targeted at rough sleepers. That's called Olive Morris Court, if people want to Google it and have a look. That's in Seven Sisters in Haringey, and that was opened last year, and that was a product that Hill had put together. And I think it sounds similar to what Reino's company producing. So it's a steel fabricated product that can be moved. So these are essentially meanwhile sites. They're stopgap solutions, like a pop-up hostel, essentially, isn't it? It's going to be there for a few years, and then in the future that site will be redeveloped, which I think is very different from the community-led housing vision that really we're here to talk about, which is more about permanency, I think.
Except in the point, just in terms of scale, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, sorry, Toby. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly relevant. I'm just saying, you know, if we focus all on that, I mean, that those things can be delivered relatively quickly, and there's a place for them because there's an essential need for it. But I don't think, from Cheryl's point of view and the wider movement's point of view, that would be where they would want to focus attention. The answer around space standards. So if you look at what happened in Ealing, so Ealing a few years ago also put in some modular housing for homeless families rather than just single people. And I think they came in for quite a bit of criticism for the space standards. And the commitment, I think, was that people would move on. So it's temporary accommodation, people would move on into something larger relatively quickly. Because bringing families with children who need space to play and learn and everything into a relatively small home. And again, I don't think what Reino's talking about is aimed at families from what I've heard. So that's where the issue would come up. Just to get really technical for a second. So under planning regulations, the hostel accommodation doesn't go through the same planning class as residential housing. So that the hostel accommodation is known as sui generis, just to drop some Latin into the conversation. It's a different kind of use. And as I say, it's not a permanent home for somebody. And that's a really important distinction. I think demonstrating that modular can produce a proper residential permanent home is really important. I think that's being demonstrated all across the country, but doing it for community-led housing, I'm not sure that I've got any examples I can give you where that's been done in London. So, you know, that's the next step. We need to demonstrate that can be done.
I think Cheryl's got a few case studies that she's going to make available through some slides that we can post in the chat. And Cheryl, I'll come back to you in a second. But Mark, just before we move away from you, can you outline a little bit of your experience of using MMC for council home delivery programs itself, and some of the limitations and some of the benefits that you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the market is evolving rapidly. A few years ago, if you'd asked me that question, I would have said there just aren't enough suppliers. We then ran a competition when I was in Tower Hamlets, and we had 40 odd expressions of interest. One or two of them didn't exist yet. You know, they were new startups, but there is a growing market in this country. And if you look at, for example, what Swan Housing Association have done with their factory in Basildon, which is producing homes like proper suburban houses, which are customizable, bespoke to different customer needs. That's the kind of thing I can imagine a community-led trust coming to someone like Swan and just buying 10 homes off their factory production line. That would work because there's a formula that they've got. You can bespoke it to an extent. That's the kind of thing that would work. Otherwise, most of the examples I could give you would be council schemes where you're building a large block of flats and there's modular elements or MMC elements within that. And that's probably not so transferable to what we're talking about.
Great stuff. Thanks, Mark. Cheryl, did you want to talk us through any of the case studies that you've come across?
The slides, they're all the ones that were sort of in the red. I put a sort of red heading on them. And these are ones that I've researched. So I haven't worked on these schemes, but these are schemes that have actually been delivered. If you keep going down to yeah, it's quite a lot there. As soon as you see a red heading with there we go. So these are different projects that have been, and a quick Google search, anybody can sort of go and find out a bit more. I'm by no means recommending any of these companies or whatever, but I'm just highlighting some of the schemes that have been delivered. One of the things we should say is that a lot of these MMC companies provide what we call a turnkey service, which is actually really important for cash flow purposes. So this project, Bushell Way in Bromley, which should probably be completed by now, 25 social rent apartments for Bromley Council. Southwark also has a scheme, 33 independent living homes for Centrepoint. If you keep going, so there's a whole range of different projects. So the companies are at the top there, and these slides really just contain the detail of what they've completed to date. So as I said, you can sort of check on Google, see the pictures and the features. I've got British Gas drilling outside, so I can't even hear very well. But yeah, there's about 7 or 8 slides here, which is really for people to go off and do a bit of research and satisfy themselves what they think about these particular companies. But there's actually, you know, quite a lot of schemes that have been delivered over a range of sizes of schemes, from, you know, over 100 units, and mainly for affordable housing. In particular, some temporary accommodation here by Premier and Modular. You keep going, so Vision in Bedford. So these guys have done schemes for pocket living. Pocket living, interestingly, they tend to design homes that are slightly below the GLA sizes, so they're smaller units, and it's essentially to make them more affordable to the market. So I won't talk through all of these because I can hardly hear myself, but yeah, I very much think people can take these and go off and have a look at these schemes and look at the features, etc., and the cost of the schemes and the speed
Fantastic.
at which they were delivered. That's important as well. And
Fantastic.
yeah, mortgageability really, which is really important for some of them where there's sales involved.
Well, that's what I want to come on to next. I mean, we're all having sound problems today. I've had leaf blowers outside. Mark's got someone having a meeting behind him and so on. So apologies for that, viewers, and thanks for struggling through, Cheryl. We'll make those slides available to all viewers after the event, so you'll get access to all of that research that Cheryl's done. Before we get onto the financial side, Reino, to give you a chance to sort of respond to some of the themes and some of the questions that have come up, particularly around cost inflation. So what kind of control have you got over your supply chain, so that if somebody makes an order, they end up paying what the original agreement was? And perhaps a word or two on the space allocation you have in your different models, because the model you described for us, I think, was for a single person, wasn't it?
Yeah. That's for Cheryl. Yeah, let's start first with the sizes. It is the 1-bedroom version is the 30, but the 2-bedroom is 68. And the 3-bedroom is 124 square meters. But that's all adaptable for the houses. By the way, the 38 is, by my knowledge, the minimum that they gave for a 1-bedroom apartment, but it is machine different in different councils. I don't know that. What also the case is, and that's what Cheryl also said, they all turnkey projects, as they're completely fixed. Everything is in it. All your appliances, your washing machine, everything is in the houses. You only put your furniture in. Coming back from the supply chain and guaranteed prices, that's also completely different abroad than in the UK. It's like we can make a fixed price for complete of next year. It's only as a certain amount of houses involved that has to be ordered. The minimum is 20. That doesn't mean that those 20 houses have to go to one site. They can go to different sites. But by the complexity for ordering the materials and producing the 20, we can achieve a fixed price for our houses. Because that's a surplus, I think, also. I tried also to do that with companies in the UK, but nobody here is willing to do that anymore. The situation seems to be a little bit different, UK supply and the supply abroad. And that's, I think, now to do with the Brexit, that so many has to be imported in the UK, and there's a delivery chain, the waiting times and things like that.
Thanks, Reino. Lev, what's your experience of community groups coming together to kind of aggregate a bit of demand? I mean, this is the word that you hear more than any other almost in talking about MMC, is aggregation.
It's been talked about, but I'm not aware of that happening, and I think it's just because we're talking about different organizations work on different sites with different timescales. I think it's really difficult. I think possibly the ones that might have the greatest opportunity for that will be an organization like London CLT, London Citizen CLT, who have kind of a bit more of a multiple project organization. So they have a couple of direct developments themselves. And again, if the timelines could work, there might be opportunities to look at there. But I'd be interested to ask Reno about this point about planning, and you know, planning itself can take quite a bit of time sometimes, but you know, at what point do you need to, if you're submitting planning, does it need to look like the system, and then you're almost locked into delivering through one supplier, or can you reserve the flexibility to go to different suppliers further down the line and get planning for whatever? So that might answer that question of timing and different sites. And yeah.
The planning in the UK is an issue, and it varies from council to council, and councillor that's in charge of it seems to be. We at the moment, we got a planning application out here in Hastings for 4, and I said the demo is arriving, and that's only the 1 bedroom. This is the first one that's coming to the UK, but really that people can touch and feel the thing. That's real, the idea about it. The planning system is something you got to go into that. We built recently a house in Yorkshire, and that was quite a process to get through the whole system. But now a lot of is established now, and you know, like what Cheryl also said with mortgages, you know, that we have a warranty, structural warranty on the houses. That's as important as everything else. You know, you can deliver a good product when there is no structural warranty or something. You cannot do nothing. But coming back on really what you asked for council and planning applications, it's a difficult one. It's like also the 1 bedroom in abroad is just placed on prefabricated concrete slabs. That's something that's in the UK impossible with your regulation system, because we've got to adapt to that. It makes, again, the construction a little bit more difficult, but it's all bridgeable, because you've got to adapt to the situation that occur and try to work with it. It's no other way to do that.
Thanks, Reno. There are two, on the finance side, there are 2 kind of aspects, I think, financially that are worth thinking about. One is the funding for developments in the first place, and the other is the sort of mortgage system and how that applies to MMC products, particularly. Mark, what's your experience of both of those aspects?
Well, I mean, in terms of the mortgageability, I think for years that's been the biggest constraint on modular taking off in this country. So there's been a lot of work done around what's called BOPAS, which I'm going to forget exactly what that stands for, build offsite something, but basically it's an assurance scheme for properties that are built offsite, so that the lenders are confident that they can lend to those homes, so they qualify through a particular process of certification. So yeah, Reno, if you don't have BOPAS certification, you need to get it. That if you want to sell the product into that marketplace, that's something that's been developed in this country, and it's now seen by the lenders as a really useful tool to just give them some assurance. Of course, they still have to look at the specific location, the specific issues around any particular site before they will lend. But it's a big step forward to be able to accredit things in that way and give that assurance. But it's not a warranty. It's not the same thing as an NHBC warranty. So all it in essence is for the lenders to have enough confidence to lend. There are obviously other warranties and guarantees needed for products that are being developed. And that's really important in terms of people actually buying the product, rather than social landlords who in a sense are willing to take different kind of risk, aren't they, in their investment in these products. So expanding it beyond the kind of emergency housing, social housing into the marketplace for sale is quite different. And I think that's, I mean, from the community-led point of view, it's interesting how much community housing is about people wanting to co-own rather than just rent a product. And Lev will probably have more to say about that, but that they share that risk around the future value of that property if they're buying something that's produced off-site, and so they need that assurance just as much as anyone else.
Thanks, Mark. Lev, who are the lenders in your experience with community-led developments? Who's willing to put money into to support them and to help buyers?
Yeah, there's a number of, I guess the senior lenders are social banks. Interestingly, one of the biggest lenders is a Dutch bank, Triodos, who have been going a long time. Another ecology building society. Most of them have kind of environmental objectives or social objectives, as well as being profit making. So it doesn't necessarily mean they take bigger risks. If anything, they're probably slightly more expensive than the mainstream banks, but they're kind of maybe more mission led in how they choose to invest and what they invest in. And then there's a whole world of smaller there's a few more I could mention, Charity Bank, Unity Trust, etc. And then there's the world of smaller social investors who then probably aren't your senior lenders, and you might need them to bridge a little bit of finance, and they tend to have very high interest rates and are also looking at what the social value is, and they might take a risk. But I think I'd agree with Mark that they tend to be probably fairly conservative in what the built product is, especially if they're looking for that as security. So it's really, I wasn't aware of the BOPAS scheme, so it's definitely worth watching out for.
Thanks, Lev. And Cheryl, what's your experience been with the trust in terms of securing financing for the development, and how has the kind of, what should we say, economic turbulence affected the process?
We obviously secure finance by the GLA to help with capital and revenue costs, and we also require private finance from mainly from the banks that Lev has listed: Triodos, Ecology, Big Issue Invest or another one. Nationwide sometimes invest in some of these specialist products, and there is a probability that the borrowing costs may be slightly above what a traditional builder can obtain, and that's due to track record, because over time you've got to build up a relationship with your funders, you've got to have a track record of delivery, and that ensures confidence, and that's how you negotiate your rates. But none of the funders necessarily are able to provide discounts, for example, because we're a CLT. However, the funders are slightly, I would think, a bit more ethical, if that's the right term. There is a bit of a commitment to these sorts of projects, and they actually believe in them, as opposed to a mainstream funder which is just simply looking for a return for their shareholders. So that's the kind of minor difference, I would say.
Thanks, Cheryl. So Reino, last word to you, really, in the last minute. Just to comment on your experience of getting financial support for the product that you're producing, and also just access to finance from an individual buyer's point of view.
It is a difficult situation. You got to convince authorities, people for the product, and the only thing what I can say about that, it is a well-proven product. It is not something new. And Mark said that in the past that he was involved in several schemes, and there were prototypes built. We're not talking about a prototype and things. There is something solid there where you can prove things with. But there are authorities that you got to prove yourself even harder. It's not only the product, it's the certifications. And as Mark just said, I never heard of BOPAS, and that was for me a new thing. Just I'm going to look in that, Mark. Thanks for making me aware of that.
And on that helpful note, that's going to be the last word. So viewers, please join me in thanking our brilliant panel for sparing their valuable time to share their knowledge and experience today, and their access to their experience of financial products in particular. Mark, thanks very much for that tip. So thank you, Mark Major from London Borough of Redbridge, and thank you, Lev Kerimov from the Community-Led Housing London, and thank you, Cheryl Scott from Brent Community Land Trust and London Community-Led Housing. And thank you, Reino Benning from Style Homes, both for your contribution to the conversation and also for the support that made this whole event possible. Most of all, as ever, viewers, thank you for tuning in again and gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with your questions as well. There are a couple left hanging, but if you join our LinkedIn Members Club, you'll find responses from our panel circulated there over coming days. Now, we're going to be back on the 1st of November at 11 a.m. with a one-to-one interview with the excellent Councillor Chris White, who's leader of St Albans City and District Council. And if you've got a question to put to him about the city's development programme, regeneration programme, housing programme, then email me at toby@3fox.co.uk, and details for registering to watch that interview are going into the chat. Meanwhile, from our fabulous panel and from Style Homes and from me and from everyone at 3Fox, good afternoon.